University of London. Delighted to welcome our dear guests from 3 different institutions to this space. My colleague, my dear friend, Dr. Richie Bartz, teaches at City University of London, and they will be chairing this event. And then what this really is, an interdisciplinary conversation between Professor Renisa Mawani from the University of British Columbia in the middle here, and Dr. Mikki Stelder from the University of Utrecht, who's sitting at the corner there. Richie will tell you more about everything that is about to happen right now, including introducing our amazing speaker. But I just want to say on behalf of the School of Law, Gender and Media, on behalf of our Center for Gender Studies, and on behalf of the center that Richie is co-chair of, which is the Center for Law and Social Justice at City University of London. These are the 3 parts that came together in order to organize this event, and I hope you will enjoy it. We will have a Q&A and all other things later on happening, but for now, it's just to say thank you for coming, and please enjoy. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Vanya, for that introduction. So now it's my turn to welcome you to this event. Also, those of you on Zoom, I hope you can see and hear us. We're going to move this back a little bit so you can also see Mikki. We can huddle in. So Oceans as Archives. Today we're going to be talking about Oceans as Archives. We're going to be talking about the relationship between the oceans, law, capital, and race. This is a conversation, as Vanya mentioned, that is being hosted by us from the Center for Law and Social Change, which is a space to bring together radical scholars from law, but also other disciplines aimed at social justice practice, and of course, SOAS School of Law, Gender Media, and the Center for Gender Studies, both in the same logo up there. So I'm really grateful for this first of hopefully many collaborative events. Really excited to also be physically hosted by SOAS. We're also running other events together with SOAS and Queen Mary and others, including the Law and Race Roundtable, where we have an event coming up on Thursday. If you're interested, you can follow us on Twitter, at Law Social Change, and see the details there. And we welcome you to come to City University, which is near Angel and Clerkenwell, Thursday at 5:00. And this particular conversation we organized is the first actually of a series, hopefully, of interdisciplinary conversations where we see where we put people in conversation and working on a similar topic, but looking at it from different disciplinary angles, right? So the idea being that we get to see what we can learn about something, about these knotty or difficult political, legal, social issues when we look at them from different disciplinary angles. So I'm going to be introducing the speakers, and then both of them are going to be speaking, or each of them is going to be speaking for 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask a few basic questions, and I'm also welcoming our speakers, I guess, to just take it away, converse together, and then we're going to invite you all to come into the conversation as well. And those of us on Zoom as well, we currently have 20 people on Zoom, so welcome you all. And we have Shrita here monitoring the Zoom. I'm going to show the people on Zoom also who's in the room, so that you can see that we have some really beautiful people all around us. And those speakers who'll be reading your questions. If you're on Zoom, feel free to ask a question in Zoom, and Shrita will read it out to you, and you'll get an answer from our 2 speakers. So, and now I'm going to just introduce the speakers. So 10 minutes each. That will take us to about 22, the hour. I reckon we'll have about half an hour then for a conversation between you, and then we'll open it up to the whole room. So just to introduce our speakers, Renisa Mawani is Canada Research Chair in Colonial Legal Histories and Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia, located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, I hope I'm saying that right, peoples. She's also Global Professorial Fellow at the School of Law at Queen Mary University of London, which is why we are so lucky to have her in London this week. She's the author of Across Oceans of Law, published by Duke University Press 2018, which was a finalist for the UK Socio-Legal Studies Association Theory and History Book Prize of 2020, and winner of the Association of Asian American Studies Book Prize for Outstanding Contribution to History, also in 2020. And then we have Mikki Stelder, who's a lecturer in Gender and Post-Colonial Studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and recently completed a 3-year Marie Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellowship for their project Maritime Imagination, a cultural oceanography of Dutch imperialism and its aftermaths. They received the 2022 ASCA Academic Article of the Year Award for the colonial difference in Hugo Grotius' Rational Man, Slavery and Indigenous Dispossession, published in Post-Colonial Studies, Media, and in Post-Colonial Studies. Sorry, I made a note there of your new job, but I won't tell your new secret. I won't be the one to
sign my contract.
Okay, all right, or maybe not. Okay. I said nothing. Reason to celebrate anyway. Renisa and Mikki, so we'll each speak for 10 minutes now. So over to you both.
Good. Thank you, Victor. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to look left and right so everybody feels included. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, I'm hidden behind the screen. So thank you, Grietje. Thank you, Vanya, for extending the invitation for us to be here. And also thank you to all those whose invisible labor went into producing this event. And especially thank you, Renisa, Dr. Mawani, for being here and agreeing to this conversation, because it's such an honor to share the stage with you. No, it's true. 4 years. I mean, it's 4 years after I ventured off to what Canadians call Vancouver, or rather Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh ancestral and unceded territories and waters, to work on my postdoctoral project, which is a mouthful. I will repeat the title later. And I was working under your guidance. So it's nice and feels like an honor to share the stage with you. But as you know, I really wanted to work with you. So I'm just going to put you in the spotlight here. After I read the amazing book Across Oceans of Law, the Komagata Maru and Jurisdiction in the Time of Empire, which I can recommend all of you should read, but maybe you've read it already and that's why you're actually here. So Dr. Mawani's groundbreaking book offers us a methodological and analytical shift from the land to the ocean for the study of colonial and legal histories of the present. And it's been such an incredible experience that I'm fortunate to call Renisa not only my mentor, but also my collaborator and my friend. So lots of love to all the organizers, all of you. So last night, and my brain is a bit fried, I returned from a fieldwork trip to New York City, or what the Lenape call Manhattan. Traveling from New York over Amsterdam to London forms a stark reminder of the deep and ongoing entanglements between the history and present of both Dutch and British imperialist projects and their contribution to ongoing processes of dispossession. This history also forms the starting point for our conversations today. But before we start conversing, we will both provide some context. So to contextualize my own work, I just finished my postdoctoral research project, Maritime Imagination, a cultural oceanography of Dutch imperialism and its aftermath. Leading up to the project, I became increasingly interested in the silences and omissions performed in the Dutch cultural and political context when it came to Dutch colonial and slavery histories. Unlike perhaps the British context, in the Netherlands, there's not been a long established tradition that examines this history from a critical vantage point. It has only been in the recent decade that social movements have pushed for more institutional engagement with this history of our present. Of course, this does not mean that there have never been any scholars or social movements who have dealt with this history previously. Anti-colonial resistance, as we all know, is as old as colonialism itself, but rather that these conversations have now moved into the public debate. What has characterized my own academic work and engagements for over a decade is that it has always evolved from social, political, and cultural concerns coming from these social movements that I've been involved in. And for my postdoctoral project, part of the inquiries that inform my work as well result from particular omissions performed within my own family's history. So in this research project, I look at the role of the ocean, ships, and shipping in facilitating Dutch imperialist expansion materially, philosophically, legally, epistemologically, and ontologically. The research began as a response to my grandfather's passing. He had been a second mate on large Dutch commercial ocean liners in the late 40s and early 50s. These were also the days when people all around the globe were throwing off the shackles of colonial occupation. However, the stories that I grew up with only concerned heroic maritime adventure stories of my grandfather, and never the colonial and anti-colonial encounters he might have experienced on these travels, even though they made these stories possible in the first place. When I wanted to ask him about these encounters, he had recently suffered a stroke and couldn't speak anymore. And after he passed, I wanted to look at his logbooks to learn more, maybe the secrets I could find there, but my mom had thrown them away. I understood the silence I found myself immersed in as a symptom of the larger Dutch context in which seafaring only seems to tell itself through stories of maritime heroism and prowess, while erasing the colonial and racial capitalist violence it enabled and that enabled it. In the Netherlands, we grow up with stories of how the country is always under threat of rising seas, that we are a small country below sea level, but at the same time that we have mastered this liquid element and the seven seas. The water and the ocean, then, are always on the horizon and are fundamental to Dutch self-perception and understandings of territoriality. It is no coincidence, perhaps, that our former Dutch Prime Minister innocently urged for a return to a so-called Dutch East India Company mentality only a few years ago. One of the first scholars to think through white Dutch self-perception is the Afro-Surinamese anthropologist Gloria Wekker. She describes the specific ways in which colonial and racial history are dealt with in the Netherlands as white innocence. In other words, white Dutch people like to present ourselves as a small nation, tolerant. We did not have many colonies. We were interested in trade, not colonization. And of course, compared to the Brits, we did not engage in the trade and enslave people much. And of course, we all know this is not true. What such a discourse produces is a structure that preempts Dutch accountability for colonial and racial violence well into the present. Wekker focuses predominantly on the impact of colonial history in the post-colonial moment. And what my work tries to do is build on and expand on Wekker's work by turning to the ocean, to see how white Dutch innocence first formed at sea in the early modern moment. I'm interested in, for instance, the ways in which maritime imagination undergirds Dutch white innocence, but also in how Dutch historiography of the transatlantic slave trade further reifies the violence of the archives of slavery. Here, of course, I'm deeply impacted also by the work of Black Atlantic feminist studies scholars, such as Saidia Hartman, Jennifer Morgan, Marissa Fuentes, Tiffany King, Christina Sharp. Looking at how Dutch white innocence first formed at sea inevitably led me to the work of Dutch East India Company spokesperson, early modern humanist, and legal scholar Hugo Grotius, who the Dutch affectionately call Hugo de Groot. For those of you who don't know, and this is, I think, a room of mostly legal scholars and students, you might know Hugo de Groot. In 1609, Grotius published the anonymous manifesto Mare Liberum, called the Freedom of the Seas. He was commissioned by the United Dutch East India Company to write a legal brief in which he was asked to defend a private merchant's capture of a Portuguese ship off the coast of contemporary Singapore. Historian Martien Julia van Ittersum has shown that this legal brief and the unpublished manuscript on the affairs of the Indies provided the groundwork for his most famous work on the rights of war and peace, a text that became fundamental for the Peace of Westphalia. In my own work, I've tried to show how Grotius needed to move away from and transform Spanish and Portuguese justifications of the colonial project through the Catholicizing mission. To facilitate this shift, Calvinist Grotius formulated a framework for justifying conquest that was based on the idea of free trade, property acquisition, and defense as fundamental for our understanding of particularly natural law. Grotius argued that if someone would resist free trade and navigation, This meant that the Dutch were entitled to wage war, take their lands, and enslave the population, all under the so-called banner of free trade. Grotius connected free trade to the specific characteristics of Dutchness. For him, the Dutch were the supreme maritime people to go overseas and engage in what he saw as godly ordained commerce. What I find very interesting is that Grotius tied ideas of becoming human then to becoming propertied. The suture between becoming human and becoming propertied rests on his exploration and consolidation of racial and colonial difference, and clearly excludes most of the human population and the more than human world. In the Dutch context, however, Grotius is still considered somewhat of a folk hero, and very few people actually know that he's been one of the founding fathers of so-called international and maritime law as we know it today. Very few people know that he was deeply involved in providing the juridical ground for Dutch imperialist expansion. It is Grotius who plays a significant role in both my own and Dr. Mawani's work. And it is through our mutual, I might call it obsession maybe, with Grotius that I ended up moving to Vancouver. Grotius has been well studied within the context of legal history and legal philosophy. It is only recently that his work has come under closer scrutiny within these disciplines to examine how his work was deeply impacted by Dutch colonial expansion into Southeast Asia. At the same time, reading this work, it seemed to me that it continues to somewhat disregard the production of colonial and racial difference within the Grotian imaginary. As a cultural and literary studies scholar, I attempt to bring my training in especially critical theory, such as feminist studies, post-colonial and anti-colonial thought, and queer studies to bear on his writings. I'm interested in what formed the conditions of possibility for Grotius legal thinking to emerge in the first place, and what this comes to mean for our understanding of the genealogy of international law. Besides providing the legal grounds for conquest, indigenous dispossession, and racial enslavement, Grotius' work provided the legal parameters for the thingification of the world ocean. Although Grotius argued that the ocean cannot be possessed by an individual or a state based on an elemental cum juridical distinction, as Renisa points out in her work, Grotius continues to subject the world ocean to a logic of property by claiming the ocean is the common property of mankind. The understanding of the world and all things upon it as a resource for exploitation of the few continues to be felt today. In other words, we continue to live in a Grotian moment. The question then is, what tools do we need to understand and dismantle this? And I'd like to leave it at that and hope we can love to hear your input on this as well. And I'll give the floor to Renisa, who will talk about this in more detail. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Vanya and Grisha for inviting us to be here, and to Dr. Stelder, since I have to be so formal now, for sharing this this moment. It's amazing to be in conversation again, and I'm really glad that we were able to be here together. So when Mikki came to Vancouver, we met very often, and we would choose chapters out of the commentary on the law of prize and booty to read together, or to reread together. And so that was really a wonderful opportunity. So my interest in Grotius actually really stems from my book, Across Oceans of Law, where I follow a single ship, the Komagata-Maru, through time and space. And one of the things that I found really striking about the work that had been done on the Komagata-Maru, and there is so much of it, amazing work, I was struck that the ship and the waters that it crossed were nowhere to be found in the conversation. And I think the sort of the moment that this became really important to me was I asked my friend Leopold Lambert to draw some maps for me. I'd been sitting in the Guildhall Library plotting the voyage of the ship as the Steubenhoek, the Cecilia, and then the Komagata-Maru. And so he made this amazing map, which is not reproduced in the book. They've made it into 3 maps, but seeing the multiple voyages of this single vessel under 3 different names was really quite extraordinary. And so, I just at that point realized that I had to actually talk about the ocean and the first place I landed was with Grotius. And so, there's this in the hermeneutics of the subject, there's a passage in which Foucault talks about the essay as as a place or as a genre that is not supposed to be a place for one to tell everything they know, but is supposed to actually change what one knows. And I feel like this book really did that for me. So I feel like I can't actually think about anything without thinking about oceans and without thinking about Grotius. And so I'm going to read from the introduction to a paper that's forthcoming, and it's called The Law of the Sea, Oceans, Ships, and the Anthropocene. And the paper is really aimed at thinking about the sort of ongoing legacy of Grotius's thinking. In an era that scientists have termed the Anthropocene, oceans have become a critical index of human-induced climate change. The world's oceans make up 70% of the planet and absorb 30% of its carbon dioxide. They moderate rising temperatures to keep the planet cool. But oceans have long been sites of anthropogenic change. They've featured prominently in European struggles over imperial dominance, served as stages for racial and colonial violence, and have continued to be vital to the expansion of Western militarism and global capitalism. The world's oceans have long been the dumping ground for human detritus, including garbage, plastics, and radioactive waste. Ships are deeply implicated in oceanic change and planetary destruction. Although their effects are not often visible on the undulating surfaces of the seas, their movements continue to pollute waters, damage marine ecologies, and produce species extinction while physically transforming the biochemical composition of oceanic waters. Today, ships carry 90% of global trade. They generate carbon dioxide emissions and other pollutants that continue to acidify the world's oceans. In the 17th century, under the auspices of the free seas and in defense of Dutch maritime imperialism, as we've already heard, Hugo Grotius viewed oceans and winds as eternal, unalterable, and unchanging forces of nature. Consider the ocean, which God has encircled the different lands and which is navigable from boundary to boundary, Grotius wrote. Consider the breadth of the winds in their regular course and in their special deviations, blowing not always from one and the same region, but from every region at one time or another. Are these things not sufficient indications that nature has granted every nation access to every other nation? But anthropogenic climate change has dramatically altered the world's oceans. In the Indian Ocean, which was a focus of Grotius's writings, ocean waters are warming faster than those of other regions. Rising temperatures are disrupting weather patterns, increasing sea levels, and endangering islands and coastal states. If the most visible sign of planetary change is sea level rising, as Elizabeth Delory argues, then oceans, ships, and maritime histories must be centered in ongoing discussions of climate catastrophe. What does the Anthropocene look like from the sea, from the tracks of moving ships that have been critical to colonialism, imperialism, and the making of an international legal order? Origin stories of the Anthropocene remain highly contested. So Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer, as we know, first introduced the concept to argue that human activity had driven the Earth out of the Holocene into a new geological era marked by anthropogenic change. Initially, Crutzen dated the Anthropocene to James Watt's invention of the steam engine in 1784, but he later revised his thinking to align more closely with the periodization proposed by the Anthropocene Working Group. Since 2009, the working group has sought to develop a formal definition of the chronostratigraphic Anthropocene, one that is associated with the great acceleration of the mid-20th century. According to many climate scientists, the 1950s marks a surge in human activity that has left measurable effects on the planet. But a 20th century focus is historically limited and politically troubling. As critics point out, it requires a willful forgetting of European colonialism, including the brutal violence directed at Indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and other colonized people, and against local ecologies of the New World, the so-called New World. The stakes are high. How can we account for the planetary upheavals of our time, Anne McClintock asks, unless we illuminate the long arc of their beginnings in the military geographies of European imperialism, the foundational violences of slavery, genocides of Indigenous people, and the centuries of ecocides and onslaughts of the environment that have shaped and are now undoing the world. Dating the Anthropocene to the Great Acceleration obscures the extractive and exploitative histories to which McClintock and others draw our attention. And I'm particularly influenced by the work of people like Zoe Todd. More importantly, for my purposes here, a 20th century focus erases the significance of the world's oceans, not only as sites of planetary crisis, but as spaces of inter-imperial contest over the emergence of a European international legal order. The international law of the sea, I argue, to which the movements of ships has been crucial, is inseparable from and deeply implicated in planetary destruction. In Grotius's account of European maritime commerce, ships were supposedly ordained by the laws of nature, as evidenced in the breadth of winds. Today, his arguments continue to inform the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So in this paper, I argue that the world's oceans and the European ships that cross them must be foregrounded in contemporary discussions of climate catastrophe. To emphasize their historical and contemporary importance, I revisit Grotius's writing on the freedom of the sea and situate his thinking within water concerns of a planet in crisis. The Anthropocene, as many have argued, is always already colonial, both as a discourse and as a long process of dispossession, extraction, and violence. What Grotius's writings point to is how an international law of the sea authorized European colonialism and imperialism under the auspices of maritime commerce and freedom of navigation, while producing an extractive view of nature that has devastated more than human life and the planet. A critical rereading of Mare Liberum and the 12th chapter of the commentary on the law of prize and booty from which it was drawn, I suggest, points to a legal history and geography of climate catastrophe that demands further attention. So I just want to sort of point to why I think Grotius is important. His writings coincide, people have made the argument that, oh, well, why are you focusing on Grotius? Many other European thinkers actually wrote about, the so-called free sea. But I think that there is something really key about the timing of his argument in the early 17th century. And one of those points is we see in the emergence of the joint stock company, which Grisha's beautiful book is focused on. But we can also see the importance of Grotius in the sort of more radical and alternative periodizations of the Anthropocene. So for geographers Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, the devastating effects of European conquest and colonization in the so-called New World is perceptible from the early 17th century. In 1492, there were approximately 54 to 61 million Indigenous people in the Americas. But by 1650, because of European colonization, the violent dispossession of Indigenous people from their lands and waterways, mass killings, and the introduction and spread of European diseases, this number plunged to 6 million. The genocide of Indigenous people, Lewis and Maslin suggest, can be detected in a dip in atmospheric CO2, which they term the Orbis spike. They call the atmospheric changes that mark 1610 as what they argue is the beginning of the Anthropocene, the Orbis hypothesis. It bears noting that the publication of Mare Liberum in 1609 coincides with their periodization of the Anthropocene in 1610. Whereas Lewis and Maslin focus on the Atlantic and the Americas, Grotius's concerns center on Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, a region that opens additional, albeit neglected, genealogies of anthropogenic change. And this has been an argument made by several people, including Elizabeth Chatterjee and Amitav Ghosh. Ultimately, a maritime view of the Anthropocene may connect these seemingly disparate geographies and histories. So although this periodization is largely discounted by scientists, efforts to date the Anthropocene in the early 17th century and in European imperial and colonial violence have generated critical and lively discussions. Scholars have drawn on Lewis and Maslin's claims to foreground the destructive role of European colonial expansion in the long arc of climate catastrophe and to stress the overlaps and entanglements between violence directed at human beings and violence directed at the planet. As crucial as these insights are in shifting attention to the world-altering effects of European imperialism and colonialism, they miss a crucial connective force that joined the so-called old world and the new, and that's ships. To begin, European vessels that crossed the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans were the vehicles that made conquest and colonization possible in the first place. Though often overlooked in discussions of settler colonialism, the ocean-going ship, as both a legal and technological form, was instrumental to the mobility of European settlers, to the dispossession of indigenous people, and the forced transport of West African captives. European ships carried flora and fauna that are implicated in the destruction of more than human ecologies. And despite their important role, ocean-going ships rarely draw comment in contemporary discussions of climate catastrophe. Yet their movements past, present, their role in establishing a Western international legal order raise crucial questions about the uneven effects and unequal responsibilities for a planet in crisis. So by taking a longer maritime perspective that centers the European ship as an imperial, legal, and technological form in the colonization of the planet, I argue that the international law of the sea that emerges and that can be traced to Grotius's writing is a condition of possibility for climate catastrophe. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to, the rest of the paper talks about sort of two legal histories that Grotius opens. One is around the sort of surface of the water and the freedom of navigation, and the second is in terms of the beneath the waterline around fishing and around the North Atlantic. So thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for those introductions to very short introductions to enormous amounts of work that you've both done in this really rich interdisciplinary and wide-ranging oeuvres that you both have. And I found it really interesting to hear also you citing geographers. I know Renisa was trying to think your official title is Professor of Sociology, but I'm sure you're not just a sociologist. You're many things, in fact. And Mikki, I know you are the same. So I'm going to do something quite unusual, I think, to start this conversation and ask you both about method and discipline, because I'm hoping, I know that, you know, interdisciplinarity is always a hot topic, and if you're doing funding applications or whatever, you're always asked or advised to market yourself as interdisciplinary. So I thought, why not take this opportunity right now with, you know, having these two amazingly interdisciplinary scholars to ask you about how and what are the possibilities that interdisciplinarity creates for you, and what tools do you bring, and why? Because you're also both talking about something that is kind of you know, you bring your tools to something that is perhaps in somebody else's territory, even in a way, if I can put it in that sort of territorial way, which is yeah, I want to start with Mikki. So how did you get the, I think you already said it actually, that it came through, in fact, through this connection with Renisa, but how did you come to write about Grotius as a legal scholar from your background in cultural studies, and what specific methods, theoretical frameworks, core sets of questions that your discipline asks, and or sensitivities that your discipline raises, do you bring to it, and what insights have these allowed you to gain that perhaps us boring legal scholars would never have come up with on our own?
I don't know. I find like critical legal studies are exciting. I somehow always end up with law and looking at law. Also, my previous work, which was on Palestine liberation, which I'm still involved in, but in different ways. But I think to start, I think that these were so many questions, but I'm gonna like jump on the interdisciplinary bandwagon. So for me, now that I've recently been on the job market, I've been on the job market several times. It's always been very hard because people ask me like, what is your discipline? And I honestly cannot answer that question, because my undergrad is in theater and performance studies with a minor in literary studies, where all we did was watch movies. Then I have a graduate degree in theater studies and in cultural analysis. And cultural analysis at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis was also founded on the principles of interdisciplinarity within specifically humanities research. So I always see myself as an anti-disciplinary scholar, I think, rather than an interdisciplinary scholar. And I take this from my colleague at Utrecht, Eva Hayward, who also defines herself as an anti-disciplinary scholar. And I find that somehow very helpful, but it's not very helpful on the job market. I can tell you that, because despite the fact that everybody is asking for interdisciplinarity, I think nobody actually wants you to do interdisciplinary work. Like the ways in which at my university interdisciplinarity is now defined is you're interdisciplinary within your discipline. So it means if you are a historian or a legal scholar, you can work with a geoscientist, you can work with a literary scholar, but you can't do geosciences, you can't do literary studies as you're also working on law and history. So for me, I'm reading in so many different fields and so many different disciplines, and it's been very enriching because it shows to me like the different, like going to different conferences as well. Some of them are disciplinary, some of them are interdisciplinary. And I think it's a missed opportunity to work in our own disciplines, especially because we are trying, hopefully, to engage with social justice, with environmental justice in our work. And what that means is you have to engage interdisciplinarily. And for me in particular, I think in my work, and I hope that shimmered through a little bit, what I always turn to is, I think, the question of how to write with or alongside movements for social change. I'm not saying I'm doing that successfully. I'm not saying I have like a book with the methods like all spelled out, but that is kind of the starting point for any of the conversations that I'm trying to engage in. And that's, I think, is what I learned from cultural analysis as well as a interdiscipline or whatever, is how, really looking at the particular context you're working with, and from that context thinking, what shall I read? Where shall I go? What shall I engage with? Both theoretically and politically and academically, right? Instead of saying, I'm a sociologist and I'm going to come to this context with my quantitative methods and I'm going to do a survey and then I'm going to put it in the computer and then data will come out and I will study that and write my conclusion. That's also fine if you want to engage with that work, but I think it's such a missed opportunity to look at actually, what context am I engaging in and what does that context need in terms of answering certain questions. And that's why I think like what you suggest, turning to the ocean, is also so generative as a method and as an analytic, because it demands that we ask different kinds of questions and we break these disciplinary boundaries, which, as we all know, are founded on coloniality, right? So yeah, maybe that's a start for that, where you can talk about interdisciplinary.
Great. And I want to slightly rephrase or a connected question for you, Renisa. So when you're writing in or anti-disciplinarily, it's a difficult word, like you might also wonder what do you expect from your audience, or who is your audience, or who are you writing for, right? Because sometimes when or some of the work that I read, or even when I was reading your pieces earlier today and yesterday, I was reading them as a legal scholar to some extent, even though I also read outside. But I wondered if you're writing for legal scholars to allow legal scholars to understand something that they didn't otherwise understand, or are you writing for sociologists to understand something about law, or are you and how do you, or are you just writing for whoever is interested in reading about the topic? And relatedly also, it can be intimidating and difficult. And I know that, like, for example, if I'm interested in, I do some legal history, but I'm really worried about saying I do that because I know historians are extremely specific about how they feel history needs to be done, and I'm worried about getting it wrong or making some like really basic mistakes and it being like super visible. So how do you deal with audience, really?
That's a great question. I'll start by saying that I'm in a sociology department, but I'm actually not trained as a sociologist. And so when I was hired in my current job, which was actually my first job, I was our department was a joint anthropology and sociology department, and I was hired in a position in legal theory. And so I was so happy because I actually have 3 degrees in criminology. And I was trained by legal historians at the MA level, and then by a legal historian, political theorist, and critical race scholar at the PhD level. And so I was never really, I didn't want to sort of follow the advice about professionalization and how important that was. And then I figured that I would probably never get a job. And so when I was hired in this job, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can just work, between these all these different fields, and I don't have to identify myself as one thing or another. But our department soon split, and I went with the sociology side. And it's been really great because I've been able to teach classical theory and contemporary social theory as well. And, as someone who has historical sensibilities and, who really has archive fever, it's been really great to sort of read primary texts and to, think about, Grotius or Marx, Engels, outside of the sort of inherited readings that we have. And I think, like Mikki, my work is really sort of driven by context. And so where I go depends on what I'm working on. And so I see interdisciplinarity as being multilingual, right? It's like, to actually be immersed in multiple languages and to see how they shape your thinking and your writing is a very difficult thing. And so it's not something, I actually try to tell my students to be more bound by disciplinary boundaries, because I worry about what that means for them in terms of finishing their dissertations and on the job market. Because I agree, actually, I think, with what Mikki said, I think that there is all this emphasis on interdisciplinarity, but we really don't know what that means. And it is very challenging. I can't tell you how many times like my work has been rejected because it's, not immersed in this or that enough. So those are sort of things that I advise my students. And in terms of audience, I don't really have an audience. I just, writing is really important to me. Like writing is a lot of labor, and I spend a lot of time revising and rewriting. And most of the time I'm trying to figure out my own thinking. I have real trouble. I'm not a linear thinker. So I'm often caught in my own sort of, processing, and the writing is what I need to figure out what I'm thinking, if that makes sense. So I don't really have a audience. I know that's a terrible thing to say. Don't listen to that. Don't do that. Don't model that. But I just write based on something that I'm really interested in and committed to. And oftentimes the historical questions or the historical questions that I ask are very much driven by contemporary concerns, right? And sort of what I'm reading is very much about, and how I'm reading is very much about, questions that are important today. Yeah. So I don't have an audience. I just write.
Great. Well, you definitely have an audience, I think. We will, yes. Great. So, kind of following on from that, really, you've both said that you write with contemporary concerns, or like the issues in the world today in mind, and hoping to provide a contribution to resolving those issues as well. And I wanted to ask you, Mikki, about our titles, so Oceans as Archives. So I know that you organized an amazing conference with the same title in Amsterdam last summer, and I was there, and it was just I just wanted to ask you about what is ocean studies, and what do you mean by oceans as archives, and in what way does it invite collaboration between people from different disciplines, but also like I know that in your conference, for example, there were a lot of activists and artists and even poets doing readings and so on. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that particular project, which we were both organizing together with Christy Flannery, who is at Australian Catholic University. Yeah. And then you can talk about like more the conceptual terrain, because it's also a term that you've developed in your work, if that's okay. So yeah, Oceans as Archives, we've hosted, Gina Heathcote was also presenting some amazing work at that conference. And we've organized it twice now. So the first was an online symposium in the first year of the pandemic. And then we met in person last year. And that whole conference started from perhaps, can I say, like a disappointment or critical concern that there is this field of critical ocean studies / blue humanities / also a blue neoliberalism, which I think, as Elizabeth Delory points out in her work, kind of also come together in very complicated ways. But this critical ocean studies has really emerged as kind of this new terrain of study. It's like some people suddenly discovered there's such a thing as an ocean, and now we're going to claim that it's a new terrain of inquiry, which I think is problematic, because if you read, for instance, in critical Pacific studies, critical Indigenous studies, Black Atlantic studies, the ocean has been, not just in like the scholarly fields, but I think also like historically has been a starting point for thinking critically about certain contexts, thinking also about like the colonial histories of the ocean as a site of resistance, the ocean as a site of death. Like there have been complicated lineages that have been thinking with and through these questions for eons, right? So Oceans as Archives really started with wanting to bring these kind of critical discourses together, because they're usually scattered as well. Right? You have an Atlantic Studies conference, and you have a conference on the Philippines and the Spanish Pacific, but they never actually meet much, I think. And we really wanted to bring these different conversations together, but not just invite a bunch of academics into the room, but actually also think through curation, to think through artistic practice, to really, when we talk about interdisciplinarity, also kind of breach that like academia and real life divide that doesn't really actually exist or should exist, I guess. So that was kind of a starting point for Oceans as Archives. What does it mean to think about the ocean as an archive? And what does it mean to bring together a bunch of people working in all these different fields? And yeah, I don't know, it was an incredible experience, and I'd love to like organize another. We're also working on an edited collection right now with some of the essays from the papers from that conference, and poets. Also, we had a lot of poetry at the conference. So what does it mean to think through different modalities of inquiry, right? Not to just think through academic critique. And I think it also came from a certain dissatisfaction, for me anyway, with the academic form as a way of thinking. So what does it mean to think through poetry? What does it mean to think through artistic practice, through creative collaboration?
Yeah, so I think, we were, as Mikki said, really sort of concerned about the kind of newness of ocean studies and of critical ocean studies and of blue humanities. And so part of what we wanted to do was to sort of foreground scholarship that has already, and artistic and creative practice that has already been, ongoing for a very long time. And so the first online version of Oceans as Archives included primarily Indigenous scholars and teachers who were talking about archives, and who were really also pushing us to think about the more than human, right? And not just the more than human in terms of marine species, but also the more than human in terms of ancestors and what the ocean actually invokes. In my own work, I had written about Law's archive, and most of that work about the sort of violence of Law's archive. And most of that work really focused on textual sources and files. And so very much inspired by the work of, by the book Files, by the work of the late Cornelia Visnan. And, as I was working on Across Oceans of Law, I felt like I really had to immerse myself in scholarship on the Black Atlantic, that one can't actually tell a legal history of oceans without thinking about the transatlantic slave trade, about indenture, about Indigenous dispossession, and how these histories come together through, the movement of ships. And so as I was working on that, I was, just struck by my own blind spots and my own limitations around thinking about Law's archive only in the textual form. And so I started thinking about, how can Black feminists and Black scholars writing about the Atlantic actually, push us to think about archives more robustly in terms of shipwrecks, in terms of chains and anchors, in terms of all sorts of materials that are found, beneath the surface of the sea. And I was also really just taken and moved by the work of Christina Sharp, and particularly this idea of residence time, right? That, all of these entities, all of these species actually coexist in the sort of biochemical composition of water itself. And so these were some of the inspirations that led us to organize and to think about oceans as archives. And as Mikki points out, it was very much also about crossing genres, right? Like we didn't want to be sort of limited to the written form. We also wanted to think about performance and about poetry and about art and about, stories. And so it has been a really amazing and really just a really beautiful experience.
Great. Thank you. I just have one final question before we open it up to all of you out there and all of you on Zoom as well. I guess this could be to either of you. So I really loved in your work, in both of your work, how you kind of mediate between sort of, as a Marxist, I'm always into agency and structure and idealism and materialism. And I really love how you pay attention to the materialism of water, the materialism of ships, as well as the ideas of grotius, and this need to rethink as well as to redistribute or be active and practice as well as think. And so I guess I wanted to take it onto the plane of environmental catastrophe and the issues that we're dealing with, that we're facing in the world today. So I've just I've been spending time in France in the last couple of months, and last weekend there was an action in a place called Sainte-Soline, where is one of the places where France has been building these, what they call mega bassins. These are several hectares large, kind of like swimming pools, but not for swimming, but for gathering both rainwater and pumping up water from the earth, ground level water, to which then farmers, industrial large scale farmers, could buy in the summer when as we know, Europe has been experiencing massive droughts in summers because of climate change. And so this is kind of a colonization. The protest was there. There were maybe 600 protesters there, 3,500 police there to protect that bassin. In the end, 200 injured, of which at least 5 seriously, and one of them is on the verge of, in a coma and balancing between life and death. And the protesters did manage to turn off the pump. The main issue with it isn't so much gathering rainwater, which is great, but you're pumping up from below and you're extracting it from all the small farms from nature, from the environment, from the rivers, from etc. This water. So I was like, my question is going to be, what use is thinking about Grotius for activists today? And I think it's like, it's almost so obvious how like Grotius' ideas are, applicable exactly today. It's like nothing's changed since the time he was writing in. But I did wonder, like, is there a risk of, by focusing in a sort of study, a bit almost like a slightly biographical, epistemological study of this one person, of overstating both this person's sort of contribution, originality, and significance, because wasn't he just saying what everyone kind of was saying at the time? Wasn't he simply, as a Marxist thinking of agency and structure, wasn't he simply understanding and writing down the understanding of the world as it then was, and as it to a large extent still is today, in terms of capitalism, in terms of even the sort of Protestant work ethic or the Calvinist ethic, and the way that we still understand in the Christian West nature and everything to have been created for our use, as it were. Yeah. Please.
Do you want to go? Sure, I can go. To tag on to especially that last part, perhaps, and then we can talk some more about, I don't know if we can, like, we need to rescue Grotius in order to have like a more solid, like, political, I don't know. But for me, I think also, again, coming from like an anti-disciplinary perspective, I am very resistant to calling myself a Grotius scholar. I think not only would that I would be a total imposter if I would call myself a Grotius scholar, but what I'm interested in is what I like to think of as the Grotian imaginary. And that, of course, includes what you just, like, he's just some guy who is recording things that were already was recording his time in very particular ways. That being said, I think what is important to remember about Grotius is that he systematized. He was the first to systematize natural law, common law, civil law, and Christian law in very particular ways, right? And that I find very interesting to think about what it means, and that's, I hope, that I'm trying to work on that in my book as well. Like this very fundamental, perhaps not a first, but a clear iteration of the relationship between becoming human and becoming property, and why it is important for me to think about this idea of what it means to become human. It's deeply inspired by also the work of Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who's trying to think through what she calls genres of the human. She actually says a history of the human is yet to be written, because all we have is a history of what she calls man, with a capital man 1 and man 2. So to think through this particular genre of the human and the role of Grotius therein, which is also of interest to me as someone who's interested in the Dutch context and holding the Dutch to account, because, he's always someone who kind of gets away with it. There's these Grotius scholars and they're in their little field, but nobody outside of that field really engages with that. And everybody just turns to Locke and to treaties of governance and British Empire, right? And there's some erasures that are performed that I'm interested in, but I think thinking through the Grotian imaginary allows us to not be reducing the conversation to a specific time or a specific geography, and that's what my work is trying to, what I hope my work is trying to do, and to bridge that kind of spatial temporal divide that we often find ourselves in when we study, right? So for me, I'm not trying to salvage Grotius or put him on a pedestal. I'm trying to
put them in a box,
smash that pedestal, and I do have a magnet on my fridge to try to remind me that I should write my book, but that's about all the ways in which I try to review this guy. I don't really care about this guy, although I do call him my boyfriend sometimes, a little bit weird perhaps. But yeah, the things we need to motivate ourselves to write. But that being said, I'm interested in the imaginary. I'm a scholar of the imaginary, and I think a different imagination, speaking, now we get to the activism part, I guess, we need different imaginaries. And that is also something that especially like Black feminist theory is teaching us, critical indigenous studies, and not new, not different, maybe things that have already existed for a very long time, right? But we need to be busy with the imagination, because in the end, law is also only, well, it has material effects, but it's like an imaginary process that creates a certain world, right? So what does it mean to really scrutinize the kinds of worlds we have created and the kinds of worlds we might want to continue to build or transform? Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I'm also not trying to rescue Grotius or to hold him up to some standard. I'm really interested in how his conception, and particularly his elemental thinking about land and sea, has really eclipsed so many Indigenous and Asian seafarers and thinkers. And so I gave an introductory lecture today at Queen Mary about Grotius, and the part that I didn't actually get to, which will come next class, was about the work of, about Islamic seafarers, Muslim seafarers, and Asian and Indigenous seafarers in the Indian Ocean region, and the ways in which they embrace this idea of the free sea, so that, people like Ram Prakash Anand make the argument that Grotius is actually that Europe was much more associated with this idea of the closed sea, which we can see in the Mediterranean, and not the freedom of the sea, and that in fact this is something that was like already, in being enacted in the Indian Ocean for millennia, and so. The part of the lecture that I didn't get to was, the number of times that the sea or the ocean is actually named in the Quran, and how significant oceans and seas are to Islamic thought. But I am really interested in this kind of erasure, and in the book, I talk about how the people on the ship and the charter in particular, and then also the people on shore who are trying to assist those on the ship, have their own imaginaries of land and sea, which are not separate or distinct, but completely intertwined and inseparable. And we can certainly see that in the context of Indigenous legal thought as well, that Indigenous people, the Musqueam, whose lands on which the university exists, don't think about land and sea as these separate things. They're completely entangled and inseparable. And so, and it is kind of ironic that the distinctions that Grotius was so intent on creating are now being undermined and, disrupted by climate catastrophe. And you can certainly see that in the Indian Ocean, and also in the Caribbean, where land is becoming sea and sea is becoming land in terms of the reclamation projects that Mikki's writing about.
Yeah, absolutely. The land grabbing, you use a different word instead of reclamation, right?
Land taking.
Land taking, yeah.
Taking.
Yeah, because reclamation is
That's a weird word.
As if you're like taking it back
yeah.
from the sea, but it always was from the sea. So that's really
What do we call it in Dutch again? I forgot.
Impoldering.
Yeah, so it's a very cultural, it's a cultural concept. Yeah.
All right, great. Super. So I wanted to open the conversation up to all of you in the room and all of you on Zoom. I can see that there's some questions already in the Zoom as well. If you like to type, if you're on Zoom with us, please do type your question in the chat, and Shrita here can read it out for you. Does anyone here in the room have a question to start us off?
One.
Let's see how many there are. I'm gonna do. Shrita, what do we have on Zoom?
Okay. We have three, I think.
We're gonna start with Vanya then.
Hopefully, but we need to call interdisciplinary, which you're talking about quite a few of us here in this room and beyond. I think very much feel kinship there, because it's precisely one of the ways in which we can manage our work, however academic or not, having any ethical or really any social and communal legitimacy. And I think it's about that as well, right? So since we are in the low space, more or less, even though this is a social space of gender studies proper, I would ask about accountability, and I would ask about in what ways you coming back to some of these so-called, fathers of whatever, including Grotius, really. To what degree then we can talk about accountability of the contemporaries, institutions of oppression. And I'm not for a second only thinking of the state, because we always do, but I'm thinking about the church. And I'm thinking about the church in the way in which the Calvinist history, in ways in which Anglican one has done similarly, has whitewashed its own, first of all, an abolitionist narrative, and then the narrative in which it's that is deeply implicated precisely around 1608, 1610, right? By the times, the high times of colonial plunder, in providing a theological space of not only forgiveness, but really of justification for the types of dispossession that include land grabbing and sea grabbing, as we can see in this case. So I wonder to what degree can you, in that sense, by holding Grotius, at least to a degree, accountable, can also hold that still very much exists, that is the Calvinist Church, accountable.
Are you okay with collecting a few?
Yeah, sure.
Shrita, would you like to read the question from Zoom?
Yes, the question is, to what extent have you each cross-trained into the hard sciences, e.g. marine biology or oceanography? And what have been your experiences in that regard? Have you struggled to read, understand papers that lie far outside your primary discipline areas? So some context this person has offered is that they just finished an MA in post-colonial ethics, and they're hoping to cross-train into forest ecology so they can incorporate that in their PhD project. And they would really appreciate some advice.
Great. And up there in the
it might be a very stupid question at this point in time, but I'm not really familiar with Grotius' work, and I feel like we were building on his work, but no background was kind of sort of like provided, so it was being difficult sometimes for me to kind of like follow all the like door process that was presented, so we can have like a good background of Grotius and his ideas. So that would be amazing.
all right, and Tammy then.
Would you want to do those three first?
I'm okay.
My question's quick.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more, each of you, about what you actually do? So method in that sense, and in particular, because I think there are people who are at least interested in law in the room. To what extent do you do law, and what do you do when you're doing law?
Cool. That's four very varied questions, so I think we have something to chew on. Yeah, take it away.
Should we take one question at a time?
As you wish.
Or do we just...
Should we start with the Grotius question? Yeah, and then the method question?
Sure.
Okay.
Can I go?
Okay, so Grotius is a Dutch legal scholar, a Dutch so-called humanist who was invited by the Dutch East India Company to write basically a justification for the seizure of 3 Portuguese ships, including the Santa Catarina, which had an enormous cargo of riches, and that the Dutch clearly profited from. And so what's interesting is that the case of the Santa Catarina was heard in 1603, and Grotius's text, Mare Liberum, which was published anonymously, was published in 1609. And so it's interesting to sort of think about that chronology or periodization and to ask, what possibly was Grotius, what was he being asked to do? Clearly, he wasn't being asked to make a determination on the case itself. And so what I think Mikki and I are both arguing in different ways, and there are very established Grotius scholars like Martin van Ittersum, who are also making similar arguments that, he was basically condoning and justifying Dutch colonialism under the auspices of trade in Southeast Asia. And, there have been lots of debates about Grotius because he recognized that there were indigenous sovereigns So unlike many of his, thinkers that came afterwards, people are saying, well, he at least recognized that there were Indigenous people and Indigenous sovereigns in Singapore and Malaysia. And so his book that was published anonymously in 1609, very short, Mare Liberum, really set this foundation for what we now think of as the law of the sea, this idea that the sea is free. What I find really interesting is that he's drawing on Roman thinkers who are writing about the Mediterranean and then projecting those thinkers onto the Indian Ocean world that already had a very sort of plural and polyglot legal system. And so I think, if one is writing about the sea and thinking about jurisdiction and sovereignty, there needs to be some kind of discussion about Grotius. So that's sort of my own orientation. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this. So Grotius was writing at a time when the Netherlands was still occupied by the Spanish, by the Habsburg Empire, which I think also includes a much greater empire than simply how we understand Spain today. And this was also a time where the Pope had divided the world into two, right? One half of the globe was for the Spanish, the other half of the globe was for the Portuguese. And especially thinkers such as the Las Casas and Sepúlveda, who wrote, like, I think a century prior to Grotius, they were trying to come up with justifications for this imperialist expansion. And those justifications were the Christianizing mission, which I deliberately call the Catholicizing mission. And the idea was, we can go to a place and we can take people's lands and enslave the population and subdue them to the church because they are not Christian, which ties in maybe a little bit to your question about religion. Whereas the Dutch were predominantly Calvinist, Protestant. So the Dutch needed a different kind of justification to, first of all, and Grotius did this, disrupt this papal claim to the division of the world into two. And second of all, to create a kind of logic of conquest that did not ground itself in this Christianization of indigenous peoples. So what Grotius did, and I think that's a regime that we still face today when we look at free trade agreements, when we look at large-scale corporations going to the Amazonas and raising the forest to the ground and telling people we're going to displace you because you can't resist free trade, right? So Grotius said, if indigenous populations resist free trade, which meant both entering of ships into ports, ships crossing across oceans, and traders moving through indigenous territory, any resistance to that would be seen as a resistance to free trade. And that, Grotius argued, would justify invasion, conquest, and enslavement. And I think that is very fundamental to think about this shift, which is also a time we're going into the Enlightenment era, and we see this kind of secularization of colonialism in a way, right? And I think that is very important to keep in mind. So we're in this time where the world was divided into two, and then Grotius comes in and he's like, we want a piece of the cake, because he said the Dutch state and the Dutch were still becoming a state at the time. The Dutch state cannot exist without trade in Southeast Asia, which is quite a statement, right? Thinking of state formation also.
And he also says that the Pope has absolutely no authority, and so should disregard this division. Yeah. So method. Okay. So I do think of myself as a legal scholar, and I focus on law. I don't know if I would call myself a legal historian, because I really sort of have a sort of conversation in my work between legal history and legal theory. And so I spend a lot of time sitting in archives, but I'm also really interested in sort of disrupting the abstraction of that law often produces, right? And so my own method is really about, how do we explode the categories of legal regimes, and that might be around sort of racial categories that law produces, or it might be around something else. My current project is picks up where Across Oceans of Law ended, and is thinking about an ordinance that was passed in response by the Indian colonial government in response to the arrival of the Komagata. And I'm, thinking about how this maritime ordinance, which was passed in response to this arrival of this shipload of supposed radicals, is being used in mountainous regions in, in Burma and Siam, and is being used to criminalize traders. But I'm telling this history through a family biography. So I'm really sort of really into biography at the moment, and telling this, the history of this ordinance, which has received very little attention. And when it has been discussed, is just about the thousands of men who are imprisoned, and not about, what this actually did to, to devastate families and their possibilities for any kind of upward mobility out of caste, for example. So, I am really, I'm looking at legal cases, and I'm looking at prison records and police records and things like that. But I am really trying to tell a kind of biography of this ordinance through this family of 4 men.
I am not a legal scholar, clearly. So I always think I should go to law school, and I should go back to school, because I feel a bit like an interloper. But you've invited me last year to LSA for the first time, and I was on a panel with someone who was like, I'm also a literary scholar. You have every right to be here. I still don't know. Speaking of a language of rights, right? Anyway, but I think for me, how I try to maybe not work with law, but work with ideas of the legal and ideas of legality is, really as a literary scholar. So I really approach law as text, as fiction. And what is it? And I think most of the ways in which I'm trying to approach Grotius as well is through really close reading the text, but close reading the text from the vantage point of mostly, I would say, like anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial critique, queer study, Black feminist theory, and what happens when we read these texts through these different perspectives. And what was really, I think, valuable for me as well is to think about, your term of the legal archive as something that is like more than just a juridical, right? Like not just law, but like all the stories surrounding laws that make law what it is today. And Gloria Becker's cultural archive, which she develops and takes from Edward Said, a post-colonial scholar, to think about, not just the archive as something that is in the institution, hidden in the basement in a box, but really think about the cultural archive as, and I paraphrase Gloria now, Dr. Wecker now, like how we look at the world, what we find sexually attractive, how we experience the world, like all these different things. And like to grasp that is, it's like a part of that is also, it's difficult to write about, but to find, and that's what I'm saying with the limitations of the academic form, is I think methodologically, for instance, like I took that picture that you see there, I've been doing a lot of underwater swimming. So I can think through, like also, and Melody Drew develops this in her book, Wild Blue Media, to think about swimming and immersing oneself into the ocean, its method, to find different ways of engaging. So feminist theory approaches, but to go on walks, etc. Yeah.
Should we answer the question about cross-training?
Yes.
Okay. That's a great question. I think that that cross-training is really important. And I've done it less with oceanography and marine biology, but I did actually do a lot of cross-training, which is really hard, around entomology, because I was really interested in sort of the insect as both sort of matter and metaphor. But I think that kind of work is really important. One of the collaborative projects that I have ongoing right now is with Antoinette Burton, who's an empire historian who I've collaborated with in the past, and also Samantha Frost, who is a political theorist who actually immersed herself in the life sciences for a year to write her book, Biocultural Creatures, and to actually think at the level of the cell, what's happening in our bodies and how the porosity of the body makes it difficult to draw a distinction between, where the environment starts and where it ends, or where habitat starts and where it ends. And so her work is amazing. You should read it. And I think it's also a really good example of what you can do when you do immerse yourself in in the sciences, whether that's oceanography or marine biology or the human life sciences.
Cool. Shall we take another round of questions,
Yeah.
or would you like?
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, maybe the person who asked the question is also familiar with the work of like Karen Barad, who comes from, I think, what is it, physics, Donna Haraway, and I'm specifically thinking here of my colleague Eva Hayward again, who started off as a marine biologist and then moved to trans studies and feminist studies, and her work is quite beautiful in how it tries to connect all these different relations. But I want to go into the world of like marine mammals, but that's something that's still in process. Yeah.
Very cool. Yes. Cool.
Vanya's
yes.
question also. Vanya's question.
Okay.
No, we didn't.
No, it's up to you.
You don't want to, I want to answer your question, I think. I mean, I did it maybe already a little bit. So just to, I think, repeat, was the question of the church, maybe rather than religion itself, right? Really thinking of the church.
You said it's a godly ordained commerce.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you cannot whitewash it out of the secular is a problematic word precisely because it suggests some sort of innocence.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I was trying to think about, right? Really like the underpinnings, right, of that secularization, especially in relation to Calvinism. And how Calvinism spreads itself, and then later, I guess, also the Church of England in different ways, right? As the basis of like how we think about international law, human rights, commerce, etc. Yeah. Anyway.
Human rights is its own religion.
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. Eddie and anyone else? More questions? Another question.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. This has been really, really useful for me to think through a bunch of things, including the relationship between climate catastrophe and history. And that's what I wanted to ask about the relationship or the way that you conceive of time in your work. So Mikki, you mentioned writing alongside social change and accountability. And I think Renisa, you also said you're not a linear thinker, you're thinking plus discipline, but also I'm thinking about linearity in terms of time. But because oceans and archives is kind of framed in this historical perspective, I'm just wondering how you locate your work and how you deal with the question of time in your work.
Great. Yeah, reading your text, I saw that already in 1600, people were aware that fish stocks could be depleted, right? Like
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I think so. Can I go first?
Please. Yeah, because I wanted to ask you the same question. So
I think I think one of the really important aspects of thinking with oceans is that things become other things, right? It's like they transform or metamorphose into something else. And so we can't think about time in a linear sense, right? I don't want to say that it's circular either, but there are these sort of disruptive, I mean, in Across Oceans of Law, I'm thinking with currents, right? And, currents are not linear, but they also have multiple centers. They're kind of polyvocal, if you will, and they move with different force and velocity in different directions. And so I think that the ocean actually offers us the world's oceans really offer us kind of arresting reality about how, or a disruptive way of thinking about time and temporality. And I think what's really troubling about the way in which climate catastrophe is periodized is that its origins are located in the mid 20th century, in the 1950s, with the Great Acceleration. And, and this is one place where I think that, and Elizabeth Delory talks about this in her book on the Anthropocene, that, instead of that in climate discussions, that's where we really see this kind of focus on one moment, right? It's like the 1950s, or it's 1784 with James Watt's invention of the steam engine. And it's like, what if we actually put all these moments together? And I make that argument in the paper, not to create a chronology, but to see how the moving ship is implicated in every single one of them. And yet is completely absent in discussions of anthropogenic change. So I think there is something really important in how we talk about time and how we periodize, and and where we think of our starting points. And so there is something I think really important about the 16th century or the 17th century. I also found it really interesting that in Mikki's paper that just recently came out, that that is like the Beamster, that is also the sort of moment, what is it called?
The land reclamation projects in the Netherlands.
So,
yeah,
that's happening. The joint stock company is happening. We see, greater sort of transoceanic movements of ships. And, it's not just about steam vessels, it's also about sail ships. And so there's work that's done by the Mortal Atlantic, and that is, his name escapes me right now. But, he talks about how mollusks would like attach onto the hulls of ships, and then would be, moving all over the place and would be devastating to local marine ecologies. Jeffrey Bolster. And or we see that William Elwad is already saying that, in the early 17th century, when he's responding to Grotius, that we see a depletion in fish stores that is evident in the life of marine mammals, and that depletion in fish stores is, because of Dutch encroachment in the North Atlantic. Or in my own, like my mother tells me about these Guinans and how, climate change was a topic of discussion, many centuries ago, and has been sort of passed down, that, at some point, because of how we're altering the environment, the sidewalks will be so hot, or the ground will be so hot that you'll be able to fry an egg or cook on it. And it's like that moment is here, right? So I think that there is also a way in which, oceans, or thinking oceanically, really is about this kind of retransformation, or a kind of recycling of past, present, and future. And so, the project is to think about, like, are there ways to get out of that, or are there ways to pursue more ethical pathways?
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that, like, what really interests me in the question of temporality as well is, like, how climate change comes to our attention, right? Because I mean, today it's like the climate catastrophe we are all facing right now. And I was reading, I'm reading two books at the same time. I was reading some of the work by Billy Ray Belcourt, who is a Cree poet and creative writer and scholar, who talks about how colonial dispossession expressed itself as climate catastrophe, not now, but upon first contact, right? And thinking also about we were talking about this orbit spike.
Yeah,
I haven't like I was like, I found that very fascinating. Like, what might it mean to read the orbit spike in relation to Christina Sharp's notion of residence time? To think about how catastrophe, like in its own entangled like expressions, comes to our attention, but literally registers in the very service of the world. And I think really indeed turning to oceans, as you say, offers us a different kind of idiom of critique. And that's a term that I get from Gina Dent, who's was my mentor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, like really to think about the kinds of idioms that we need to develop in order to address these kinds of issues, right? And then time or temporality really is a central, like rethinking what we understand with temporality is very important. Yeah.
Or even Catherine Youssef is Queen Mary, right?
Yeah.
Catherine Youssef's work about 1 billion Black Anthropocenes, right? That this has been happening, and it's only like that it now registers for, you know, the world because it affects, you know, non-Indigenous, non-Black, non-colonized people.
Yeah. Great. You had another question.
Yeah. That was like, I mean, it's more like I'll be very curious to hear your reflection on, since we're talking about oceans as archives, like linking it to like UNCLOS, like Treaty of the Seas, right? What can, and based on like what you said about colonialism and environmental destruction and, you know, access to resources, that like what kind of reflection would come up to your minds when you try to kind of draw like a parallel and link between like the understanding of oceans and archives and the current development, you know, the kind of like the convention for the law of the seas, and what can that tell us about like resource exploitations and, you know, also for countries that do not really have any access to the oceans as well, what are the implications for a treaty that you know, sort of treat the ocean as a common, right? And we all know that that is also kind of like the ideology of like the tragedy of the commons, right? Which necessarily, you know, the way which was developed was drawing on kind of, you know, the communitarian way of life that would necessarily result in the tragedy if not managed by the locals, right? But I really much think that the tragedy of the common really kind of realizes it prophecy when contextualized with national states, for example, right? Because also national states and the entanglement between national states and the development of capitalism, capitalist conditions, right? Which can really much result in the tragedy of the commons if that is simply like dominated or kind of you know, regulated by states and for states. And so what is your reflections on using working archive and development?
We have a question up here.
Yeah, thank you so much for my question is more on the sort of terminology that we're using here. I'm really interested in your idea of oceans as archives, because I'm really interested in the idea of whether we should evacuate or excavate from the archives. Should we be leaving? Should we be recreating the archives at all? So my question here is really like, why are we recreating the archives in these really new innovative methods that you guys are using? And why not make them something different? Why not evacuate the archives altogether and name it something completely different? If we're talking about, you know, creating new idioms for time, we might as well use a different word for the archives, no?
Right. Shrita, do you have anything on Zoom? No?
Those are great questions. And do you want to, well, I mean, so I'll just say that I'm, as someone who works in archives all the time, you know, I really do have, you know, I joke with my students that I really do actually have, you know, what Derrida calls archive fever. On the one hand, you know, it's great to think critically about the archives and to, you know, make all these claims and about, you know, erasure and violence and emptiness and silence. And, but I'm still like, while I'm here, I just arrived yesterday. I have like a big, long plan for this week of going to the London Metropolitan Archives, where I'm going to be looking at the Bombay Burma Trading Company records and going to the British Library. And so there is something very captivating and seductive about, you know, even though one knows full well that it's this site of power knowledge, but there is, so I don't want to give up on archives. And, you know, and I think also like, I have a close friend who works in marine archaeology, and just sort of thinking about the ways in which these kind of archival silences and gaps are being filled through the ways in which, advances in various technologies around marine archaeology are enabling people to tell us about, what life was like on a slave ship, for example, and what are what other countries that or sort of empires that we haven't sort of discussed enough are implicated in the slave trade. And so I think that I want to hold on to the archive. And, but I also think that we need to think about sort of materiality and what that materiality can tell us. And of course, so many years ago, sorry, I'm like suffering from serious jet lag. Alan Sekula talked about the body as archive, right? And what might we, I'm just thinking of Sam Frost's work and, how might we think about the body as an archive in terms of the cells and the kind of work that cells do. So not in the way that Sekula was talking about it, but actually really about the work that our bodies themselves are doing in relation and in response to the environment. So I want to hold on to it. Mikki might have a different sensibility.
I'm not as attached to the term. But then at the same time, I'm perhaps would like to shift that question to thinking about the how. So how do we then engage? Which is a slippery slope, like for all the things that you just brought up, right? So I'm not attached to it, but I'm interested in like the methodology, then how to approach the archive. And for that, I don't have a clear answer because it depends on what you're working on. As for the comments, I talk about it a little bit in this paper that this article that was just published, where I'm trying to think about the commons, maybe not in terms of the tragedy of the commons, but the anthropocentrism of the commons, and particularly the relationship between Grotius's idea of the ocean as common property of mankind, right? Because people say, oh, Grotius doesn't see the ocean as something that can be owned, but actually he does. Like that's the argument in my paper, because he sees it as common property, which as you show is European men, but I think more generally, today, it means seeing the ocean as property of humans, right? And I think the ways in which within UNCLOS, the common heritage principle, I mean, we must say the common heritage principle, and especially Samra Esmir has written a beautiful article about this, came out of the Bandung and what was called at the time developing states propositions to kind of disrupt the Euro-US stranglehold on the world ocean and the coast, right? That is the emergence of this common heritage of mankind principle, which you probably know. But then what is very interesting also, the ways in which that became co-opted by specifically the US and the International Seabed Authority. And we can see here how these kind of perhaps radical principles, and we can't even question that because Samra Esmir also argues that the common heritage principle still depends on an idea of the nation state as a starting point for thinking that. But how these kind of anti-colonial ideas very easily become co-opted and appropriated and misused in order to support, especially U.S. imperialism at this time, Euro-U.S. imperialism. And I think what is interesting to me about the ways in which the commons now take shape in these negotiations, such as the BB&J negotiations and UNCLOS, is really, it doesn't leave this orbit of property, which is what I'm trying to show in the article. And what does it mean to understand the ocean as a resource for humans, right? And then do we need to formulate, again, attached to it, or how a different understanding of our relationship or relationality with the sea, right? Our bodies are literally, 80% water, right? So we're inseparable from the ocean. We walk like we came from the sea, right? So what does that mean to understand, to think critically about this kind of anthropocentrism of the commons, and specifically now in international law with the UNCLOS and BB&J negotiations, maximum sustainable yield, what does that what does that really mean, right? What does it mean to understand like the ocean as we have this like marine protected area here, but then Shell and BP can go like deep sea mine over there, and the twain shall never meet. Like that is the ways in which like law stratifies the relationship we can have to the sea, right? But like, what does it mean to not be able to juridically or legally have a different relation? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we have to be very careful in how we use the commons also within our radical movement, and understanding the anthropocentrism that undergirds that, and also understanding that relationality can also be thought differently, not through this history of the commons and the Paris Commune and this kind of Eurocentric understanding of the emergence of the commons.
All right. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to close it, right? Thanks so much, everyone, for their brilliant questions. Thanks to our special guests for a brilliant conversation. Thanks, everyone on Zoom, for bearing with us as well and being there. Thank you for your help with making this possible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Sylvia.
Oh.
Sylvia.
All right. And just a final round of applause for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Watch this space for more events at Law Social Change and at SOAS. At SOAS.
Not on Twitter.
Follow me.
But I'm not. I am, but I'm not. Yeah.
I am not on Twitter. Can I close?
Uh,
No, that's mine. No, that's mine. I don't know. Is that mine? Oh, no, that's mine. Oh, yeah. Thank you for running.
Thank you so much.
This week's